Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Okay, first, a little housekeeping. If you're supporting the podcast through Patreon, you should have received an email from me announcing that I'll be leaving the platform on September 1st. We'll send out a couple more emails over the next few weeks, and I'll say this on the podcast a few more times, I think in August, just to make sure I reach everyone. Email is not as reliable as it once was. But as I said in that email, I don't leave Patreon lightly. In fact, there are more people supporting me on Patreon than through my own website. But there are now many reasons why it's become important that I consolidate support for the show on my site. However, you might be interested to know the proximate cause of this decision. I noticed the other day that Patreon canceled the account of a conservative journalist, Lauren Southern, without warning and without, as they stated, any possibility of appeal. Now, I'm not taking a position with respect to Southern. I'm actually not really familiar with her work. But this happened the same day, or at least I heard about it on the same day, that Richard Dawkins was deplatformed at UC Berkeley. And this is an action that should go down in the annals of PC insanity. This was right after his book, The Selfish Gene, was voted the most inspiring science book of all time in a public poll that was commissioned by the Royal Society. So the left continues to eat itself. But these events are part of a wave of deplatformings and demonetizations on YouTube and elsewhere, and this is being driven almost entirely by leftist confusion about free speech. I consider myself well left of center on almost every topic. But this is just the Wild West out here in terms of people organizing campaigns of protest against totally legitimate and blameless scholars and journalists and scientists. And I realize that I just can't afford to have this podcast be even slightly vulnerable to the whims of a third party like that. This shouldn't be read as a criticism of Patreon. They obviously can't vet everyone on their platform, and they're liable to get it wrong when they try. I think they've been providing a fantastic and much-needed service. As I've said on this podcast many times before, I think the future of digital content lies in audience support, not in ads. And Patreon has really stepped into that space almost by itself. So please don't get the wrong idea here, but in the current environment, I've decided I need full control over my platform. This could be a costly move, I recognize. Needless to say, I'm hoping that those of you who are supporting the show on Patreon will make this transition with me and become monthly subscribers at samharris.org. But I will be deleting my Patreon account on September 1st. So if you want to support the show, there is only one place to do that, and that's at samharris.org/support. And again, your support is making all of this possible. I've got some very interesting guests coming up. I'll be talking to the security consultant Gavin DeBecker soon. He wrote The Gift of Fear, which was an extremely influential book. In fact, I think it's the best-selling book on violence ever written. I think I have that right. Gavin handles security for half of Hollywood and Silicon Valley at this point, and he has thought really deeply about violence at every level, domestic violence and workplace violence and terrorism, assassinations, really everything. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to producing a podcast there that will be truly useful to you. I think it's not too far-fetched to say that that's a podcast that could save someone's life. Just the law of large numbers almost guarantees that. There are enough of you listening that I can guarantee some of you will be the victims of violence or attempted violence at some point in the near future. The last time either a blog or a podcast where I talked about this, I got an email, I think the next day, from someone who found himself in an active shooter situation in an airport, having just listened to my describing active shooter situations and what one should do in those circumstances. So this is what happens when you're talking to a lot of people. Anyway, I look forward to that conversation with Gavin. I've also rescheduled Robert Sapolsky, so that will finally happen soon. And Max Tegmark, Lawrence Lessig, there are many smart people on the horizon. And I have some events coming up in Toronto, Vancouver, New York, London, Phoenix now. I believe Phoenix is now available for pre-sale to supporters of the show. Los Angeles, and more cities coming. When tickets become available to the general public for these events, as they are for most of those now, they can be found at pangburnphilosophy.com. Pangburn, P-A-N-G-B-U-R-N, philosophy, all one word, .com. Okay. Today I am speaking with David Brooks. David is one of the nation's leading writers and commentators. He's an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, and he appears regularly on PBS's NewsHour and Meet the Press. And he's the best-selling author of several books, The Social Animal, Bobos in Paradise, and most recently, in the book under discussion, The Road to Character. And in this episode, we talk about that book, The Road to Character, and it was a very interesting book where David goes into the difference between self-gratification and self-overcoming on some basic level. So we talk about things like sin and self-esteem versus self-overcoming, and the significance of keeping promises, and the ethics of honesty and related matters. Inevitably, we get to Trump. There was no way I could let David Brooks escape without telling me something about his view of the current political landscape. But that does not dominate the podcast, for those of you who are sick to death of the topic. Our time was somewhat short. It's interesting that an hour on this podcast feels quite short, but David had another interview to get to, so enjoy it while it lasts. And now I give you David Brooks. I am here with David Brooks. David, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's a great pleasure.
So we've only met once. I'm trying to rack my brains to find another time, but we met at a meeting organized by the great John Brockman at one point. Does that square with your memory as well?
I do remember that. John Brockman is the Zelig of modern American culture, or global culture. He shows up everywhere.
Many people don't know this, but he controls much of our intellectual life. So I want to talk to you about two main things. I want to talk to you about your book, The Road to Character, which I loved. And then I think we will inevitably talk a little about a very different road, the road that one man took to the White House. I know my audience is sick to death of Trump, as I am. I think if there's a God, he probably is sick of Trump too at this point. But I can't have you on this podcast without getting your take on what's going on in Washington. So I think we will arrive there, but we will first go toward topics that I know are dear to your heart and mine, which is really the nature of our moral lives, or lack thereof. So let's start with how you came to write this book and what you mean by character, because character is like many of the words you use in this book, is not a word that tends to roll off the tongue without any self-consciousness at this point. How did you come to this, and what is character in your view?
Yeah, it's not a great word. It's not a word I like, and I'm not even sure how often it's in the book. But when I came to have a title that could, in one word or at least in a couple words, summarize sort of moral development, that seemed to be the word that at least people sort of got the gist of what you were talking about. Whereas moral development itself, as a phrase, sounds clunky. I started to write a book about humility. And at first, it was just going to be about epistemological humility, really building off work that Danny Kahneman and a lot of other people have done about the shortcomings of our own thinking processes. But then as I got into it, I guess my tableau expanded. And I started thinking about moral humility and all different kinds of humility. And basically, I mean, when you're sort of doing what I do, you sort of work out your own crap in public. And so I achieved way more career success than I ever thought I would. But I never had, and still don't have, the sort of joyous demeanor and radiating goodness that I see in other people. And so I just sort of wanted to figure out, how do they get that? And so the book, I really took a bunch of characters, more or less randomly selected, who were pathetic at age 20 and kind of amazing at age 70. And I just wanted to know, how do they grow into much better people, which they all did.
Yeah, the story is really told through these different characters you profile, and people like Dorothy Day and Montaigne and Dr. Johnson. And I guess as time is short, I don't want to go into many of them, but one jumped out at me, the profile of George Marshall, the general, who is not as famous as he should be, perhaps, though the Marshall Plan is named after him. In writing about character and writing about virtues that are, again, that we don't really have the moral language anymore to talk about without really straining. And we'll get into the significance of words like sin and wisdom and other words that people don't use so readily anymore. But in the character of Marshall, I was struck by the fact that so much of what you describe about him is clearly noble and deserving of really nothing but praise. I mean, his level of self-sacrifice and self-abnegation and his willingness seemingly at every turn to put country before self, to put the needs of, in this case, the President of the United States before his own career goals. But it was hard to actually envy him. If I could teach my children to be good, I'm not sure I would give them that particular piece of software he was running. So why don't you just summarize briefly the story you tell about Marshall, and in particular about the way in which he didn't make the moves when his career was really reaching its apogee to become the far more famous and influential general that he might have been.
Yeah, he grew up in Pennsylvania, and he was a very shy boy and a very poor student. And his older brother went to VMI, Virginia Military Institute, and Marshall wanted to go too. And his older brother said, "You know, George is kind of pathetic. Let's not let him go there because he'll ruin the family name." And so he was not an impressive young man, but he ended up going to VMI, and he ended up really loving military life. And military life really was the making of him. He joined the institution; it gave him discipline. It turned out he had a habit of command. He was never a great student, but he had a habit of leadership. People wanted to follow him, and he had a spirit of rectitude. And so he rose through the army, sometimes seeming on the outside extremely conservative and staid, even as he was revolutionizing a lot of things within the army about fighting with tanks and how they did train future soldiers. So he was a bit of a quiet rebel within the army. And then my favorite Marshall story happens, he's already head of the army in 1943, and he really wants to run Operation Overlord, which is the D-Day invasion. And Churchill and Stalin had both told him he was going to get the job, and Harry Hopkins had told him the same. Uh, but he had a code that he would never campaign for himself because he feared his own ambition. And when Roosevelt called him into the Oval Office, Roosevelt said, "Would you like to run Operation Overlord?" And instead of just saying yes, Marshall said, "My own personal ambitions should have no bearing on your decision. Do what's best for you." And Roosevelt asked him four times, and four times Marshall said, "It's not about me, it's about you." And Roosevelt took the chance to give the job to Eisenhower, and Marshall was crushed. And it was the one day he went home early in the whole course of the war. And so it hurt him, and he would have been a much more famous person if he'd run the D-Day invasion, but he wouldn't be Marshall. And he was someone who's not only admired by history, but he's admired by those around him, which isn't always the case. The people who knew him best really admired him the most. But I sort of get the chilliness about him. He had a quality that we associate with Greek and Roman times of magnanimity, which Pericles had, and I think George Washington had. And it's a great man doing great service to his country, but at the same time, he's detached and he's emotionally cold. And so he gives himself a certain grandeur, but he loses familiarity and friendliness. Marshall could be very friendly and very intimate, but only in the tightest circle of trusted friends. With everyone else, he was a bit standoffish. And so during the war, he wouldn't call Eisenhower Ike the way everyone else did because it was too familiar. He was aloof. And I do think that does make him a little hard to love.
Yeah, and it's not so much hard to love. That's probably another point, but I noticed that many of these things that we immediately recognize as virtues, in this case, his willingness to be self-effacing, even when he in some basic sense, deserves all the praise that is coming his way and the advancement that is being offered. Certain virtues are in tension with other virtues, and it's hard to actually want to emulate him in that moment, given that you could also tell a probably an equally ennobling story about doing what is appropriate to actualize your gifts in the service of others. His rectitude was in tension with just kind of an honest acknowledgement of perhaps who's the best man for the job. And many of our moral considerations seem to have this structure where it's not really a matter of good versus evil or sin versus virtue, but it's sometimes a matter of prioritizing various values that are all values that we actually hold and can endorse, but there is a zero-sum conflict between some of them some of the time. Do you feel that that's the way the landscape looks to you, or do you see it mostly a matter of always seeing clearly what is right versus wrong?
Yeah, I'm on your side. I think the values are incommensurate, as Isaiah Berlin would say, that things don't fit together neatly, and sometimes things are in tension and they create paradoxes. And so a lot of the characters I write about in the book, more so, if I had to do the book over, I wouldn't include so much of this. They had a virtue of reticence, and Marshall had that. Francis Perkins, another person from that era, had that. But it also gave them the vice of coldness, or the virtue of reticence took away from the virtue of friendliness. And so, one of the features in the book that's informed my thinking a lot is Augustine's ladder of loves theory. He says we all love a lot of things, but we know instinctively that some loves are higher than others, and that you should love honesty more than you love money. For example, you shouldn't lie in order to get money. Or if a friend tells you a secret and then you blab it at a dinner party, you're putting your love of popularity above your love of friendship, and we all know that's wrong. And those are cases where we love two different things, and it's pretty obvious which one's higher. But there are other times where it's not obvious, and that the two different loves are in tension. And sometimes you have to pick one, or sometimes your personality more or less inclines you in one direction or another.
Yeah, well, in your discussion of this, you oppose various things. You talk about the resume virtues versus the eulogy virtues. You talk about moral realism versus moral romanticism, and there are many more. So maybe we can track through some of these because it's a very useful structure. What are the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues?
Yeah, well, I should say one of my mental weaknesses is I have a weakness for dualisms, and I see them everywhere, and I'm persuaded by all of them.
In this case, it's a strength, but I take your point.
And so the eulogy virtues and the resume virtues are things I more or less took from a guy named Joseph Soloveitchik, who was a rabbi in the mid 20th century, and he said we have two sides of our nature. One side which is about conquering the world and being majestic in it, and those are the resume virtues, the things that make us good at our job, whether it's a good teacher or a good nurse or doctor or whatever. And then the eulogy virtues are the internal side of ourselves, the things they say about us after we're dead, whether it's being courageous or honest or capable of great love. And my argument in the book is that we live in a culture that knows that the eulogy virtues are more important. We'd all rather be remembered for our character traits rather than our career. But we live in a culture that emphasizes the career parts, not the latter. And we're just a lot more articulate about how to build a good career than how to build a good person. And our universities in particular are much more confident in talking about professional rise than a moral or spiritual rise for a lot of different reasons. One of them, my colleague at Yale, Tony Kronman, who's at the law school, says specialization causes us to look at the narrow focus of different subjects, but never step back and look at the whole person. And so his argument is that specialization causes us to abstract from the whole quality of our conduct and makes us focus on, how we're doing it as potential lawyers or academics or whatever.
Yeah, well, there's another opposition that is relevant to what you just said. You talk at one point about talent versus character. To view a person as a collection of talents that need to be maximized, there's a kind of utilitarian and transactional way we think about ourselves and our interface with the world. And it's not the same thing as developing a truly moral character and seeing that as an ongoing struggle against limitations that are not a matter of your jumping through the kinds of hoops that your talents or your specialization would dictate.
And my shorthand way to say that is that if you're going to pick out a career, then go with your strengths, go with the things that you're naturally talented at or want to be talented at. But if you're thinking about your internal growth, pay a lot of attention to your weaknesses. And one of the things that pretty much all the characters in the book do is they identified what was their core sin, their core problem. For Marshall, it was his ambition. For Eisenhower, another character in the book, it was his anger. He had a terrible temper. For others, Dorothy Day, she was sort of over emotional and fragmented, uh, and and they waged a daily drama against their weakness. And so, I would say, if you want to be a good person, and if you don't work on your weaknesses, you'll end up like Richard Nixon, being swallowed up by them.
I think there was someone in the book, it might have been Dorothy Day, who was urged to major in an academic subject that was her weakness just to overcome that, to not take your career advice here and focus on your actual talents. What was that, Dorothy Day, or was that someone else in the book?
That was Frances Perkins. She was at Mount Holyoke, and Mount Holyoke then, as now, was quite a remarkable place. And they really did think we're training people to be really good people. We're not worrying about their careers. And it was a women's college, so there was some sexism in that. But they said, listen, if you can major in the field you're weakest in, that will build your character, and you'll be able to conquer anything. And to that school's credit, they sent out young women. Perkins was class of 1903. They sent them out to Pakistan, across Africa, across Asia on these service trips, and they would spend years abroad. And somebody did a census of all the missionaries abroad, I think in around 1920, and some ridiculous percentage, like 20% of them were Mount Holyoke grads. So they were armed with a sense of mission and a sense of toughness on how to conquer life's challenges. It was quite a remarkable place.
So you think we lose something important when we lose concepts like sin and evil and virtue and wisdom and humility, that we lose a moral language that not only affects how we talk about these things, it actually affects whether or not we recognize a kind of inner landscape and lead a kind of examined life that really becomes impossible unless you have the concepts, unless you have the landmarks you can even acknowledge exist and to shoot for. Some of these words I find myself using, and I can do so without any kind of self-consciousness, but sin isn't one of them because of its association with Christianity in particular, and because of some of the liabilities of the way in which it's interpreted. This is something you point out in the book. Sin can be, and has been, so often invoked against genuinely healthy pleasures. I mean, it really is set in opposition to what most of us would consider a healthy sex life, for instance. How do you think about sin?
Yeah, I do think we need to recover a lot of these words because it is the vocabulary of the internal landscape. And we happen to have a culture, say, in Western civilization that for 2,000 years has been Christian or Judeo-Christian. And so a lot of the best thinking about um, uh, these concepts comes from people who come from that tradition. And whether we're believers or not now, I think a lot of their thinking is still useful and still helpful in thinking about how to have a good life. Now, the word sin was, as you say, ruined by people who used it to punish sex or used it to crack down on being a kid a lot of the time. But I think it's useful because it points to the fact that there's sometimes just screw ups in our nature, that there are bugs in the machine, and that some of them are characteristics of just the way we're wired, and that we should be aware of them. I think we all have a tendency to be selfish and to see the world from our own vantage point. David Foster Wallace, in that famous Kenyan address, said, "We don't even think about it, but we see the world as before us, behind us, beside us, but it's all revolving around us." And I do think that's just a screw up in our nature, that we're too self oriented. And I think it's possible to have a concept of sin that doesn't rely on, the original sin and even something explicitly religious. The what I talked about earlier about having your loves out of order. I think that's a good way to describe how sin happens. That sometimes we just have a tendency to get our loves out of order, and we go for some short-term pleasure, like popularity, over a long-term virtue, like being faithful to our friends. And I think it's useful to revive that word just to remind ourselves how sort of broken we are, even while we're splendidly endowed in other ways. Another word I think is worth reviving, which has explicitly religious connotations, is the word grace. Sometimes, and the way I would say it in non religious terms is sometimes you get sick or you have a trauma, and people you really are close to somehow disappear. They don't show up for you. But then there are other people you barely know, and they completely show up for you, and they're very great friends to you at that moment. And that's unmerited love. That's undeserved. And I think it's as as it's important to recognize that sometimes we have these flaws in our nature. It's also important to recognize that as people and as a race or as a humanity, uh, sometimes we just get unmerited benefits that we don't deserve, and sometimes the universe is much kinder to us than we merit, and that's grace. And so I think all these qualities are useful if we're thinking about our place in the world and our spiritual development.
How do you think about the self as the center of this project? I mean, one way to talk about the road to character is in an opposition between self-esteem. At one point, you flag that in the book, and self-overcoming. Talk about your view of the self, the thread upon which all of these various questions and considerations are strung.
Well, I do think, like I said, we're splendidly endowed, but also deeply flawed. And so I sort of wrote the book because we've had 30 or 40 years where we've been given the self-esteem movement, and in big ways and small. I just read in the newspaper yesterday that nearly half of all high school students graduate with an A average or an A minus average. So we're pretty good at telling each other how great we are. But I think this has robbed us of a virtue that maybe existed a little more in times past than now, which is the virtue of humility. And I define humility, it's not my definition, but the one I like best is radical honesty from a position of other centeredness. The ability to see yourself with complete honesty from sort of a detached position, to see where you're strong and see where you're weak. And so to me, humility is clarity of vision about yourself, whereas pride is warped vision about yourself. And the characters in the book, in part of their ability to struggle against their own weakness, was to see their own weaknesses very clearly. And I do think that was a trait that was maybe a little more common, say, in the 1940s than today.
Well, another thing that one thinks about in this vein is parenting and the kinds of values and the mode of self understanding we would want to impart to our children. And I'm struck by how different it seems the values here begin to flip because obviously we have been convinced, most of us certainly have been convinced, that one thing you want to impart to your children is a healthy sense of self esteem and even in many cases pride over their accomplishments and a very clear attention to their weaknesses is not something that gets emphasized, and one could argue it probably shouldn't be emphasized until a certain point. I mean, until a certain point closer to adulthood. How do you think about the project of being a parent in light of this conversation we're having about one's own road to character?
Yeah, this is actually something I noticed after the book came out, which I didn't really notice while writing it, that all the characters I chose, pretty much all of them, I think, had really amazing mothers, and who just poured love, a lot of love into their kids. Their fathers tended to be a little cold, and I think that was true because a lot of the characters grew up in the early 20th century. I think there was just a lot of coldness between fathers and kids. And so, and I've read about this subsequently, that a lot of people, and I'm not recommending this, I'm just making an observation. A lot of people who grow up to be phenomenally successful have one parent who gives them unconditional love, often the mother, and then another parent who gives them is cold and gives them very conditional love. So they've got strength, but they've also got insecurity, which they struggle very hard all their lives to overcome. And I wouldn't want to raise my own kids that way. I think both parents should be giving unconditional love, but that is something that all these people had. I do think if I had to write the book over, I the main story that I tell in the book is very individualistic. It's Dwight Eisenhower struggling against his weakness. It's Dorothy Day struggling against her weakness. And I think the book, in retrospect, is a little is too individualistic. I see the self as too self-enclosed. And if I had to do it over again, I think I would emphasize first the love that was poured into them, that really built a strong sense of themselves, and then the way they were able to die to self after that was achieved and pour a strong sense of love into other people. And so I'd probably write it a more communitarian book if I had to do it over again.
Well, it's a point you make at various points in the book where you say that this can't be done alone, right? That we rely on other people both in terms of their guidance, but just almost the geometry of the situation. So many of our flaws and our strengths, our sinning is exposed in relationship. It's not something that it's done in the privacy of our own minds merely. It's because we're entangled with others. I mean, if you're going to be dishonest, I suppose you can be dishonest with yourself, but the sin of lying is really something that only comes out in relationship to others. And so it is with the strength of humility or anything else. It is a point you make, but it's true that these stories are the stories of a fairly solitary effort to be better than one was yesterday.
Yeah, no, I think the book I'm trying to write now is about promising and about all the promises we make. And I know I think that self conflict and self improvement is part of character building or part of what it means to be an adult. But being faithful to one's promises may be a more important part, and what you choose to promise faithfulness to, and then how you execute on those promises. That strikes me as a little more central, and that's essentially a social exercise.
Yeah, and it's also confounded by the structure of the self and its lack of coherence. Because when you're making a promise today, you are making a promise that your future self has to keep. And given that the self doesn't have this unchanging integrity, given that it's a process, it's a verb more than it is a noun, you then arrive at that point in the future and feel hemmed in by this promise that your past self made. You have to really be clear about the value of keeping a promise in that case. You can't merely be motivated by your own desires at that point, assuming it's something that you no longer want to do.
Right, and then that's even true in the act of making a promise. I read a book. I'm now forgetting the author, I'm afraid, but and she was a philosopher, and she described the vampire problem. Suppose somebody came up to you and said, I can turn you into a vampire. You can fly around at night and you can live forever. You'll have all these magical powers. Would you like to do it? But once you turn into a vampire, you can't turn back. And and how would you know? Because you, as your human self, doesn't know what it feels like to be a vampire self. And her point was, we make a lot of decisions where the act of making the decision changes who we are, and you can't go back. And so the act of having children, getting married, going to med school, joining the Marine Corps, all these things changes the self. And so when you're making that decision, you have no data about who your future self is going to be and what it's going to like. And so it makes those big decisions in life very hard to do.
Yeah, well, I spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about and talking about the self as an illusion. It takes a few minutes to fully describe what I mean by that, but it's in harmony with the Buddhist view of these things, which is that the self is not the self as most people take it to be this unchanging center of. I believe my friend Dan Dennett coined the phrase "center of narrative gravity." This idea that there's a core to us, the thinker of our thoughts, the center of our experience, that is unchanging, that is carried through from one moment to the next, and is perpetually accountable for everything we think and do, that we are the authors of our thoughts and actions and intentions. That, upon analysis, whether it's subjectively through meditation or philosophically just by just thinking about it, or even neurologically, looking for such a thing in the brain, that breaks down. That I think is an untenable idea, and what replaces it is a kind of flux, a kind of just various states of self where you begin to notice that you can be remarkably different in different situations and with different people. Certain people can call out in you very different sides of yourself, which you are helpless to reproduce in other relationships. And I think most of us find this. I mean, you'll be very funny with one person and you can't possibly find anything even mildly amusing with another. And the fault is not merely with you, it's with the dynamic. And so it is with every other side of yourself you experience. And so it is this kind of flow which, to map that on to your project of building character and becoming better than we were yesterday, it is a flow that has to be regulated by a value system, by concepts like the ladder of loves that you invoked, which is, despite the ever-changing psychological reality where you are buffeted by thoughts and whims and desires continually, you still have to have some sense of a map that articulates a direction worth going. And this is what moral language and concepts are for.
It's something I struggle with. I'm friends with a guy named Walter Mischel, a psychologist who's most famous for the marshmallow experiment. But the
Yeah.
other side of his life is he did a series of experiments with children about who was honest, who was an honest kid. And it turned out the people who were extremely honest at school were extremely dishonest at camp. And it depended totally on where they were, how people described them. And I think he
Right.
certainly has a point. On the other hand, I do think there's some legitimacy to the big five personality traits, which do have some constancy across time and maybe even across life. But I also think, and I'm curious if you agree that, and maybe this is what you're getting at, is that over time we can build constancy, not in a straight line, but by tying ourselves down to certain things and by committing to certain either professions or environments or people, and that we do come to a point, or at least come into a unity or closer to a unity than we were maybe when we were adolescents.
Yeah, no, I think you can change your self or the direction that your mind and life tend radically. And I think one aspect of this is the humility engendered by looking closely at what you're calling yourself and seeing that you didn't make yourself, right? So that your strengths are a gift, right? You can't really claim that you are the author of anything good really that you find in yourself. And many people hear that as something somehow disempowering. It's not. I view it as freeing, but one thing that collapses there is certainly pride of the pathological sort. I mean, you can't take credit for your intelligence or your capacity for effort or anything else that you notice that's good in yourself. But on the other side, you might fear that it erodes a capacity for shame, but not necessarily. I mean, it's like you're not really to blame for the bad things you find in yourself, but you can still be committed to correcting them because you still have a preference for the kind of life you live. I mean, you have to understand to invoke a word you use at various points in the book. I mean, wisdom is, for me, a matter of charting a course in this world that escapes unnecessary suffering. And that heuristic, it sounds kind of superficial stated that way, but it runs very, very deep, which is if you're living a life that is not wise, that is morally synonymous with, needless conflict with the people around you. Whatever your intention to form loving relationships, it's continually confounded by your misbehavior and your following, short-term desires and overlooking long ones. It's synonymous with not having the career you actually want because you've put needless obstacles in your way. All of these things, whether or not you created the tools you find in yourself to navigate this terrain, you still want to navigate it, and all you can do is use the tools you find in yourself as intelligently as possible in each moment so as to move in the right direction. And to your question about whether structure or tying yourself down to something works or matters. I think it absolutely does. I mean, so one thing I've often recommended is the ethic of just not lying really ever. Putting dishonesty on the continuum of violence where you would be dishonest in a true moment of self-defense, right? The Nazis come to the door and ask whether you've got Anne Frank in the attic or some analogous situation. But to generally just be committed to not lying, I think that's an immensely clarifying thing to do, which is at odds with much of human nature, as you know. And so your inclination to lie, your inclination to shade the truth is constantly exposed once you have made that vow, essentially. That's one example of a kind of discipline that I think can corral this what's otherwise this shapeless mass of, sometimes I lie, sometimes I don't, who knows what I'm going to say next, which is the way most people, in my experience, relate to the question of whether or not to be honest or dishonest.
And I guess I would say another way of saying what you're saying, I think you agree, is that if we have divided selves, then the discipline of not lying is one part of the self, trying to slowly engrave habits in maybe the unconscious part of the self or the intuitive part of the self. And I think that's what character actually means in the original form. It means to engrave. And so it's a gradual process of carving dispositions into some deeper part of yourself.
Yeah, no, I think that is a good way to put it because it does so much of learning anything, learning to swing a tennis racket has this structure too, where you are, at first you don't know how to do it. You have a conscious goal and you're given a conscious recipe, and actually learning to do it is a matter of pushing that recipe back into parts of the brain that you're not conscious of. With a motor task, it's a procedural memory. And once it becomes that, then you don't even know how you swing a tennis racket or a golf club or anything else at that point. And to think too much about it is to degrade your performance. And I think much of our moral life also has that structure, at least potentially, where you begin to learn that being a certain way and being virtuous, again, to use a strangely loaded term, actually feels better than tempting moments of non-virtue. And you begin to feel the emotional cost of giving in to the thing that you otherwise had to convince yourself was a good idea, like telling the truth even when it's uncomfortable. You become sensitive to the way in which when you're tempted to lie to someone, that is synonymous with actually having fallen out of relationship with that person, where you're no longer on the same team. Whatever seemed to be true a moment ago, now your own desire to avoid awkwardness, say, is in contest with your actual connection to this other person and their goals and what they feel they need to know about the world. But again, I do think it does get, to use your terminology, engraved on this unconscious part of ourselves, where we then it becomes our default procedure.
Let me bring it back maybe to sin. Well, you said that a sign of unwisdom is the creation of needless conflict and needless suffering. Um, Now, Martin Luther King was someone who I think we would probably consider wise, but he certainly created a lot of conflict. Uh, and he did it, I think, because he had this awareness that there was this sin of racism and segregation. And so it was he was appealing to something a lot higher, and was willing to cause a lot of conflict along the way because there was a higher truth he was seeking that was beyond just who's suffering, who's unhappy, who's frankly who's suffering in this. Would you agree that that appeal to some higher standard sometimes necessitates suffering? Because I certainly speak as someone who avoids conflict whenever possible, and that's one of my weaknesses.
I would certainly agree with that there are, and again, this is back to this issue of competing virtues, where sometimes your desire to avoid suffering, yours or others, is in competition with some higher good. I mean, if your child needs a medical procedure that she doesn't want and is scared to get, but she needs it, well, then you just have to figure out how to impart a different lesson here, which is, as unpleasant as this is, we recover from these experiences. There's this question of, when you're trying to improve a society or trying to get anything done that is valuable on at some kind of scale, well, then other things can't get done, or other things can't get funded, or other or sensitivities that people want respected can't be respected because they are ill-considered, say. I spend a lot of time criticizing religion, as I think you know, and this upsets a lot of people, but I do it because I think religion has more than its fair share of bad ideas that need to be criticized, and that it would be good for us to have a more searching conversation about the contest between reason and faith, for instance, or the validity of revelation, the idea that any book was written by an omniscient deity. So that pisses people off to hear those things talked about in less than respectful terms. But I mean, I only do that because I think there is a larger good to come of it.
In the book, my book, about half the people are religious and half are not. And I would say one of the things I notice among the religious characters, and Augustine is the prime one, but Dorothy Day might be the better example, is they're more motivated to be good. And sometimes doing the hard thing or the right thing it's not a question of knowing uh, what's right, but possessing the proper motivation to actually go ahead and do it. And I would say, all the people I write about are strongly motivated to try to be the best person they could be. That's why I wrote about them. They're not average. But I would say the religious people, there's a stronger source of motivation.
Yeah, well, I think we'll have to leave that aside. I think you and I could have a long conversation about religion and its significance and its necessity in certain cases or not. But I just can't let you go without getting your view of the current political situation. And I know your time is short. So I want to segue. I mean, the bridge between what we were talking about and Trump is fairly direct. I mean, in my view, Trump is the walking annihilation of more or less everything we've been talking about. And I don't actually think that puts it too strongly. I think this is something I've talked about a lot on the podcast, but it's just, he strikes me as a distillation of everything that is wrong with the American character. This could be, in large measure, a caricature, but he has brought the caricature to life. If you take our materialism and our ignorance about the rest of the world and our satisfaction in our ignorance, our overconfidence, our pretension to greatness, even when we're actually being merely petty, our vanity, our sexism, boorishness, narcissism. I mean, all of these are the antithesis of the kind of project you're articulating in your book, a kind of childishness that doesn't have the virtues of childhood. I mean, it's a kind of malignant childhood that is just all boastfulness and me, without any of the curiosity or sympathy that you meet in actual children. He is the living embodiment of a kind of American grotesque. And again, I'm a little self-conscious about this calumny against, America, or the ugly American, but it's almost like he is a golem that has been conjured by the worst things that have ever been said about us as a country. I mean, it's like, if he can't grope it or put gold letters on it, it doesn't exist. And so I just want to, in these last 10 minutes, it's got to be very interesting to be David Brooks thinking about politics at this moment, or very painful. What do you make of the current situation with Trump?
Well, it's humbling because I wrote this book on humility and it came out, and then the election happened, and you like to hope to think your book will have some influence. And I like the least humble
Right.
human being on the face of the earth. And I do, I more or less agree with everything you said about Trump and how he's a negation of what we've been talking about. But, one of the things I found while writing the book was the extreme power of celebrity culture. And I talk about these UCLA studies they do of college freshmen. They ask, what would you like in life? And it used to be fame was the thing of the 16 characters that was at the bottom. People didn't want to be famous. Now it's number two or three. There's just a great desire to be famous and the celebritification. And here is a man for whom celebrity and celebrification and self promotion are sort of the sum and substance of his character. And I guess what surprised me over the course of this last 18 months is the moral flaws that don't ring any bells, that don't set off any alarms in a lot of people. So I do think he is perhaps the endpoint of a certain narcissistic tendency that a lot of people have been writing about for 20 or 30 years. One of the questions to me is whether we snap back from it or whether this is the new standard that to which we all conduct our lives and politics on from here on out.
I remember you writing in a fairly recent op-ed, maybe a month old now, and as you know, the news cycle just cleans the slate more or less every 24 hours now. So I'm wondering if this still holds. But I remember you saying that you were worried that we were getting ahead of ourselves on the Russia investigation and that it seemed less substantial than the Whitewater scandal when you were attending to it back when you wrote for I think it was the Wall Street Journal. Does that still seem true to you? Has anything changed since Don Jr.'s emails came out?
Yeah, that seems less true. What I had said was that based on what we knew at that point, there wasn't any evidence of collusion. Now, obviously, we know the Don Jr. meetings happened. And I think I'm more alert to the possibility the way Russian oligarchs may have invested in Trump properties and funded his empire in ways we don't know. And so I gave myself the out in that column um, that if we discover something that there was collusion, then there's collusion. But so far we haven't found a lot of collusion. But as of now, we found a little more. I still don't think it's the kind of scandal that's going to bring him down. I could be wrong. There could be another series of revelations. And my colleague Ross Douthat said of Trump, um, he lets you down every time you try to give him the benefit of the doubt. And that's certainly the case. So I shouldn't warn, but somehow my instinct is that somehow he's the thing that uh, is most destructive about him is not this scandal. It's the inattention to policy. It's the lowering the standards of the way government works, the way society works. And I guess I was pushing in that column against the Watergateization of our politics, that we would imagine that there's some scandal who's going to remove the person we don't like from office. And that's been a sort of a destructive tendency in both parties over the last 25 years.
Yeah, I must say that I've been rather eager for his impeachment, but I do share David Frum's impression here, which is that the worst things about him are all right on the surface. I mean, to focus narrowly on collusion is to miss the fact that we have known all this time what's wrong with him, and you just articulated some of it. But I mean, to the fact that we have a president who has nothing but good things to say about Vladimir Putin, that's the problem, right? And that's not impeachable necessarily. I mean, I guess there may be something that could make that impeachable, but the people who are hoping to see him removed are in danger of focusing on something which in the end may not be provable, but is among the least significant of his many visible flaws.
Yeah, and just to have some humility, at least on my part, I always think it's important to separate him from the people who supported him. Not all of them, but a lot of the people who supported them. I certainly have spoken to dozens of Trump voters who have a pretty realistic view of his character. I think they underestimate the damage that someone with bad character can do, but their view was he's a jerk, he's a narcissistic, he's a blowhard, he's probably a misogynist, but he's my shot at change, and I need some change. And so my one formula is that Trump is the wrong answer to the right question, and that people were willing to tolerate a guy like that because things were going pretty badly in their lives.
Oh, you do have to recall that the choice was between him and one other person, Hillary Clinton, and there were many reasons not to like her that many people found. But it is very hard for me, given the kinds of concerns we have just expressed in this conversation, it's very hard for me to understand how people don't see the ethical and political significance of the endless lying, for instance, and the degradation of our discourse. I mean, just to have a president who, hate tweets journalists and beauty pageant contestants. And I mean, there's something so unseemly about his presidency that I just don't see how establishment Republicans, the Paul Ryans of the world, don't struggle to put some daylight between themselves and this phenomenon on moral terms.
Well, I obviously wish they would. And, I know a lot of people who are the sort of people who work in Republican administrations. And a number have come to me and said, well, I've gotten this offer to go work in the Trump administration. And should I do it? And in the beginning, especially, I thought, well, we need some sensible people in there to sort of restrain this guy and keep it sort of just some normal human beings to try to keep the government from completely falling apart. But then I noticed the people I really cared about, I would advise them not to go in because you're inevitably going to be soiled by defending this and by sort of defending his dishonesty. And now I'm almost wishing nobody would go in just because I think the destruction is so strong that I hate to see it radiate out and touch other people, and I just want it to be over with. Though I don't see how it sustains itself, but I don't see how it ends either. And so I'm sort of just left agape. There's also the one thing I do blame voters for is, when you're a kid, you think your parents are perfect, and then you become an adolescent and you discover they've got a flaw, so you decide they're completely terrible. And I do think a lot of people have gone through that transition about American institutions. And because they don't want to think they're perfect, they've decided they're completely rotten. And so they're extremely negative about all politicians, all governments, frankly, all media. And it's just not the case. The people I know in government are mostly in it for the right reasons. They're usually good people stuck in a rotten system. But that cynicism that everything's rotten, they're all corrupt, is what tolerates dishonesty because you think, oh, he's just another one of them. And that's actually not true. He's not another one of them compared to all the other people I cover.
Yeah, and that extends to the media as well. I mean, this is the same attitude that imagines that InfoWars is the same as the New York Times because both commit errors of fact. Yeah, it's the leveling of all values and all truth claims there. So anyway, David, we have to resist it, and you've been resisting it impeccably in your column for the New York Times. So please keep it up.
Thank you. I have no choice. I need the job.
I know you got to get to another interview. Thanks again for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in person whenever that occasion arises.
Hope that happens soon. It's a great pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
If you're enjoying the Waking Up podcast, there are many ways you can support it at samharris.org/support. As a supporter of the podcast, you'll get early access to tickets to my live events, and you'll get exclusive access to my Ask Me Anything episodes, as well as to the AMA page on my website where you can pose questions and vote on the questions of others. And please know that